Hej allihopa! Swedish verbs might look tricky at first, but today I will do my best to help you make them simple. This is part 1 in my series about Swedish verb tenses. Today we are going to focus on the imperative tense and the present tense as well, because these are kind of the building blocks that you need in order to build different kind of tenses in Swedish as well. In following videos, I will be covering infinitive, preteritum, perfect, plusquamperfect and future tense as well. But for now, let's focus on presens and imperative, and by the end of this video, you will be able to give someone orders and also tell people what's going on right now. First, let's start with imperative, because this is actually the form you need to memorize if you want to make the other verb tenses in Swedish as well. So infinitive is actually the form that you usually find in a dictionary, for example, and many people think that this is the form you need to know in order to make other tenses in Swedish as well. However, that's not true. You actually need to know imperative because this is the base for the other verb tenses. So what is imperative? This is the form that you use when you want to give someone a command or a request in Swedish or in another language, of course. And the good news is that in Swedish, imperative is very easy. It's basically the base or the stem of the verb itself. And there is no particular ending or anything you have to put at the end. You just need to know what the stem is. So here on the screen, you can see some examples of verbs in imperative tense in Swedish. Here we have sit, stå, läs. Notice how these are really short and simple. So how do you know what's the imperative form of a verb in Swedish? Because when you look at the dictionary, you mostly see the infinitive form, not the imperative. So in some instances, it's the same as the imperative. You just remove at in front of it. For example, att stå is just stå in imperative. Or att jogga is just jogga in imperative. However, sometimes you have to remove the a at the end. For example, if you look at the dictionary and you see att sitta, then the base, the stem of the verb is sit, and that's the imperative form. Or att äta, then the imperative form is ät. The best tips I have for you when you're memorizing new Swedish verbs is to actually memorize the imperative form. Because if you know imperative, you can make infinitive, you can make presens, preteritum, perfect, plusquamperfect, and even future tense, futurum. So there is no clear rule how to make the imperative because it's the base or the stem of the verb. However, remember that it's either the same that you see in the dictionary, the infinitive form, or it loses the a at the end, and then you get the stem. And remember, yes, there are irregular verbs, of course, but still most verbs are regular, so focus on those first, and then learn the irregular ones little by little. Here you see a couple of examples with verbs in imperative form. Skriv här på raden. Skriv här på raden. Gå hem till mamma. Gå hem till mamma. And here's a mini quiz. Pause the video and answer before I give you the answer. How do you say eat this now in Swedish? Eat this now. Remember, the verb needs to be an imperative. Ät det här nu. Ät det här nu. So now let's move on to presens, present tense. And presens is usually used to describe things that are happening right now or things that are generally true. Here you can see 2 examples of verbs in present tense. Jag går till mamma nu. Jag går till mamma nu. Hon läser en bok. Hon läser en bok. And here you can see that the verbs går and läser are both in present tense. So how do you make present in Swedish? Well, it's really easy if you know imperative that I taught you before. because you put R or ER at the imperative in order to make presens. If the imperative ends in a consonant, then you put ER at the end. For example, ät becomes äter. And if the imperative ends in a vowel, you just have to add R at the end. For example, stå becomes står. Here on the screen, you can now see a few more examples. So for example, les imperative becomes leser, and then when you put it in a sentence, jag läser en bok. Or for example, imperative jogga ends with a vowel, so it becomes joggar, and then we have the sentence jag joggar utomhus. So notice how we use the imperative, the stem of the verb, when we make this present tense. That's why it's so important for you to memorize the imperative when you learn new verbs in Swedish. And here again, most verbs are regular. However, there are also irregular verbs in Swedish, so those you will have to memorize separately, unfortunately. So here's another mini quiz. How do you say I go to the supermarket in Swedish? The correct answer is jag går till snabbköpet. You can also say jag går till affären or butiken. That's also correct. So now I want you to practice by making 3 sentences in the comments using either presens or imperative that we learned today. I will check all of your comments and let you know if you made it correctly or if there were a mistake. Don't worry if it's not perfect, that's why you are here, to practice. So let's recap. Imperative is the command or the request and is the base of the verb, the stem, like sit, stå, ligg, läs, and so on. Presens is what's happening right now or what's generally true, and you put er or r at the end of imperative in order to make presens. Like sitter, står, läser. In the next video, we will cover infinitive, hjälpverbs, and also future tense, so keep an eye out for that as well. Don't forget to practice and write your practice sentences in the comments. That's how you improve. And if you have any questions or if anything is unclear, then please let me know and I will try and help you the best that I can. Tack och vi ses!